Brigade Fáilte ag an grinú seán 8 an seo nó san an Galmont gahar na Gaillimhe. Couple of fógrabeg sal dosimmuid imachtaí an chruinniche mar derma Brigade Fáilte. I have a few housekeeping notices to make first. Welcome everybody. Just to let you know that this is broadcasting live on multiple platforms on the internet as well. We're going out live on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter, as well as being here in the Galmont Hotel in Cahir na Gaillimhe. I will give you a short outline of the format of the meeting. We have a panel of guests, as you can see. They will each speak for 3 or 4 minutes, and then I will question them, one or two questions based on what they said, and then I'll open it to the floor, and you can decide for yourselves how many of you want to quiz them. Apart from that, I have very little else to say, except turn off your mobile phones, please, or silence them at least, so that they don't interrupt the meeting. And we can all try as well, we're all seated, but if you have to get up and go out or anything, just to be careful as regard masks and physical distancing and things like that. Everybody in the group seems to be wearing a mask for the moment, apart from the panel. I'll introduce the panel. Las Uachtar on the Ulskal na Héad an Gaile, Dr. Polo Doherty is here with us. Ibrahim, now Imam, Ibrahim Noonan, I wanted to get it correct, is here with us as well. The author, Calvary Movery, is with us. Calvary is in Ireland for over 30 years, but is of Indian origin. And we have Mairéad Farrell from Sinn Féin, who's with us as well. We've had apologies from a member or two of our panellists. Eamon O'Keefe couldn't make it, nor could Martin Ward, who was due to be on the panel. So without further ado, because we're a few minutes late starting, and I know everybody wants to get home to their beds at some stage tonight, we'll start off with the conversation. This is about going towards a united Ireland. As we know, the conversation has started. Some people want it to happen, some people don't. The latest polling seems to indicate that there's a huge majority in the Republic in favour of a united Ireland, as long as they don't have to pay for a united Ireland. Maybe that's one of the questions that will come from our discussion this evening. There's also, of course, the polling north of the border, which is obviously central to all this, which shows that people aren't quite as certain, even in the nationalist tradition, aren't quite as certain, because there are certain things like the National Health Service that they'd have to sacrifice in the case of a united Ireland or a border poll, or not necessarily sacrifice, but there may be some uncertainty about it. So they may be some of the topics that come up. You'll have to forgive my English as well. So my English could be kind of stilted at times, and I apologise for that. So without further ado, like I said, I'll introduce our first guest. I'm going to go left to right, no discrimination, no drawing of straws or anything else, and ask Polo Doherty to talk to you for a few moments. And tell of Polo Doherty.
So we could obviously talk about education, we could talk about economics and all sorts of things, but I wanted to focus in on identity in the 3 or 4 minutes that I have. And that is really around how we accommodate an Ireland of diverse identities, both accommodating the new Irish, with very often their hyphenated identities, which their children and grandchildren may find is no longer hyphenated. And I think a lot of work has been done south of the border in that, but also in the north in terms of making British identity comfortable in a united Ireland. I think we've moved a long way in all of the discourse in this country from the idea that unionists are just deluded Irishmen. Unionists are not a monolith, by the way. There are diverse identities within the unionist community. Some regard themselves as British and deny any notion of Irishness at all. Others are comfortably British and Irish. Others are quite happy to be just Irish with a political leaning towards Britain. But we need to work out ways in which we can actually accommodate that in a united Ireland that actually is open and inclusive and makes that identity unthreatened. Now, for some, of course, you will not persuade. And we've got to accept that from the start. If we are sitting back and saying that we have to have complete unity in the north before we can have any movement, then there will never be any movement. And I don't think that's an acceptable standpoint, because it amounts to shifting the veto from, or shifting the bar on a united Ireland from a majority in the north to a majority of unionists. And by definition, unionists are not for a united Ireland. But nevertheless, we can engage in a discourse and an accommodation, a discussion around how we actually create an Irish political and civic identity that accommodates diverse national identities, that accommodates diverse political leanings, that actually protects notions of Britishness in the northeast. I mean, those notions still exist in parts of the Republic as well. Let's not delude ourselves that they only exist in the 6 counties. And that therefore, in fact, when that political change comes, which is unlikely to be unanimous, it's never going to be unanimous, I don't think that can be the bar, but that we actually then create at least a scenario in which the same people of unionist descent, or the same people who would now be regarded as of unionist descent, the Empire Loyalists in Canada, the people who are still Orangemen in parts of the world that are no longer under British control, can feel comfortable in their identity, and that is not in any way threatened in a united Ireland. So I think a big part of it for me is that fundamentally we've got to move away from the notion that we've got to persuade everybody in the north before we can move to united Ireland. But part of that is also then about the south being ready to embrace change. And there's been a lot of discourse around, how important is the flag to you? And there are certain ironies around that, because there are some people who would be 26 county nationalists, if you like, but who insist that the flag is really important, even though the flag is fairly meaningless in a 26 county context. The national anthem, are we prepared to change that? Personally, I'd say yes, as long as it's not Ireland's Call as a substitute for it. But also then, even things like making sure that when unification comes, it isn't simply a southern takeover of the north, the way it was a West German takeover of East Germany in the 1990s, that actually has led to anything but unity between East and West in Germany even 30 years later. And that means, therefore, I think, to tick one of the core fundamental points, and that is, there's a phrase that pops up in official speak in the south of Ireland, and I think it's intensely ambiguous and potentially offensive and exclusive, and that is Ireland and Northern Ireland, where the 26 county state has appropriated the name Ireland for itself. And if you think about that phrase, semantically it includes the 6 counties twice, but politically it's meant to say Ireland stops a couple of miles north of Dundalk. And then the question becomes, if you're creating a new united Ireland, well, if the 26 county state is already Ireland, what is the 32 county state supposed to be called? And that then gets echoes of a southern takeover of the north. So I think there's a lot to be challenged in the southern perceptions of what Ireland is about as well, southern establishment perceptions of what Ireland is about, if we are to have an inclusive united Ireland. And the last thing I'll say is, ironically, and I would go back to the point I made that unionism is not a monolith, I think there are actually very diverse views, whatever about what the political spokesmen are saying, and they very often have to play to the hardest wing within whatever part of the union spectrum they're in. But there has been a lot of engagement, especially since Brexit, where actually discussions and discourse that were seen as somehow off the wall and fantasy land and never land 10 years ago are now actually everyday discussions with unionists open to the possibilities of change and open to what some of us hope is the inevitable. And I think and ironically, it sometimes seems that sections of unionism are more open to it than sections of the southern establishment. So I think there's a lot to challenge in both jurisdictions as we move towards a diverse and inclusive Ireland.
I'll introduce you now to our second panellist. This is Imam Ibrahim Noonan. Ibrahim is a native of Waterford, lives here in Galway, and has embraced the Islamic faith, and he will introduce now to you his opinions and his viewpoints on this topic. And the first thing you said to me this evening when I spoke to you, Ibrahim, was, I'm in favour of a united Ireland. Maybe we'll start from that point. Why?
Well, firstly, I would say why is because I grew up in Waterford, as you mentioned, native Waterford, and into a really strong Roman Catholic family and a Republican family for that matter as well. And I lived next door right to where the flag in 1848, where the first time the tricolour was flown. And literally my house next door to that. That became a great symbol for me, being a young Irishman at that time, coming from a strong family that I came from, both in Waterford and Cork. When I migrated to the United Kingdom to study in the University of Wales, of course I studied theology and philosophy. That was my passion. But I also faced, whilst I was in the United Kingdom, unfortunately, what was meant to be Irish in the United Kingdom at that time in the 80s, prejudice of being Irish, always being accused of being terrorists, etc., etc. And I was always, one way or another, pushed aside as being different, as being not belonged, shouldn't be there. Ironically, I suppose, I eventually chose to embrace the faith of Islam, as mentioned, And that gave me a new bearing in life on how there should always be equality, there should always be inclusion of everyone and anyone, no matter what faith they belong to, what race they belong to. It doesn't really make a difference. They're all human beings. So for me, a united Ireland has to be also an all-inclusive Ireland on the island of Ireland. It has to embrace everyone and anyone, regardless of their faith, regardless of their race, regardless of wherever they've come from. If someone's born on the island of Ireland, then they should be deemed as Irish as every other person on this island. And that's one of the passions I have for that passion to ensure if in any role I can have a role in that and play my role helping that. So for me, a united Ireland is about recognizing everyone and anyone through education, whether that's through political efforts as well, to work together to create a united Ireland, to bring a united Ireland about. I think it's time for united Ireland. I think Ireland, New Ireland, will become, for me, definitely a beacon for the rest of the world. And why I say that is because if we can demonstrate from, when I say we, I mean the people of Ireland, that we can embrace change and difference and embrace other cultures which are not necessarily the same as Irish culture. That means whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Hindu, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're Asian, Arab, whatever it may mean. It means if you can embrace that, then that is how the new Ireland should be, and that is how the united Ireland should be. The tricolour has a great symbolism because Thomas Francis Meagher, when he came up with it, in his mind and in his vision, was to reconcile essentially two different communities, and that was Protestant and Catholicism, was to reconcile them in peace and to unite the whole country in that. And that is exactly how I see the flag being a symbolism even now. That we, being Irish, should look at others who are being Irish as well and bring them together and make them feel that they're part of this Ireland. We have seen in the 90s, the late 90s, and in 2000, Ireland was heading in the right direction. It was embracing that change, but unfortunately, along the road, there has been bumps in that road by others who didn't agree with that. So that's why I am very adamant in my mind and in my soul that a new Ireland, a united Ireland, has to be a people who are united as one nation, as one people, and that they move together, walk together, run together, and help each other, regardless from where you are from. We have people now of other backgrounds representing Ireland in the athletics, in other sports as well, which is a great thing to see. So this is my vision for my desire for the united Ireland, and I would like to say that Galway City demonstrated this when it granted us to build the very first mosque, purpose-built mosque in Galway, with a dome and a minaret. I remember the day that we made the application to Joe McGraw, who was then the city manager. It was on the same day they were voting in Switzerland whether they should allow domes and minarets. And we were concerned, but he, with absolute generosity, said to me, absolutely not. We will be allowing you to have, and it's your right to have this. This is the Ireland I want to see. This is the new Ireland I want to see. A united Ireland on this front. And I believe we can become, as a nation, a great beacon for the whole world.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, Imam, and Noonan. Then we'll move on to our third panelist. We're getting some very interesting insights, and we will get more now from Calvary, Movery, who is a novelist, a writer, is of Indian origin and is intrigued by the parallels maybe between the causes of India and Ireland. Paul mentioned Germany earlier, the reunification of that country. India, of course, has not been reunified post-partition. Pakistan and Bangladesh are still there. But Covery will talk to us now about her experience, I suppose, of that problem and her unique insight into the whole story. Covery.
Thank you, Maureen. And I'm so honored to have been given the opportunity to talk today, because I think, when you're talking about Ireland's future, you have to include the new Irish. And so I'm really very grateful to have been asked to speak today. For years now, as a family, we have got by with vague, euphemistic descriptions of ourselves. Indian born, of Indian origin, from India. But there's no escaping what we really are. And I have of late taught myself to say it aloud. I am an immigrant. Recently, I dropped the I word at a gathering of friends who shushed me collectively. Don't be ridiculous, they said, you're Irish, for God's sake. Which brings me to the point. Are the two things mutually exclusive? And after 34 years in Ireland, am I still an immigrant or am I Irish? Decades ago, when I arrived in Sligo, my local corner shop lady told me to listen to Gay Byrne. Apparently, he had a finger on the pulse of Irish society. So I did. It was a real revelation. Irish and Indian societies shared the same mores I discovered. Close family ties, strong religious upbringing, a hangover from brutal colonial history, and an unhealthy obsession with home ownership, big weddings, and brown envelopes. Ireland is now my home, and I've always been accepted as a neighbor, a friend, and a colleague first. And the fact that I was from India came way back last. Of course, children have a totally different notion of what constitutes difference. Their perceptions, I think, are far more telling of the nation's true state of play. Take my then 7-year-old, who, when she was in her communion class, inquired about her baptismal certificate. You haven't one, I replied, because you're a Hindu. She was shocked. Oh, thank God, she said, sounding so relieved. I thought we were Protestant. I bit my tongue and held my peace. Out of the mouth of babes, as they say. Many immigrant communities in Ireland come from countries that have been fractured by tribalism. We have seen opportunities lost because everybody wanted to talk and even shout, but nobody was willing to listen. And if you think immigrants have no notion of what it's like to be partitioned, please think again. The majority of us come from countries and regions which were cruelly colonized and that have suffered the effects of very arbitrary divisions by the colonizers. Believe me, we know what it's like to be divided. And I'm nailing my flag to the mast here, speaking personally. My hair absolutely stands on end with wonder that I might actually see a united Ireland in my lifetime. For decades now, the only legal immigrants into Ireland have been the ones that Ireland wanted and that Ireland needed. So, in Ireland's future, what should the country expect of its immigrant citizens? Its mushroom pickers, its nurses, bartenders, bus drivers, and meat packers. Please don't hold us up as examples only when we are scoring the winning goal for Ireland, or when one of us does a life-saving heart transplant on a neonate. Most of us are like most of you, just ordinary people doing ordinary things, leading ordinary lives, making our quiet contributions to society. Respect us, please, even when we are ordinary. Speakers in previous sessions have spoken about the hurt felt by the nationalist community in the North. Paul just referred to that as well. Just imagine then the hurt that the immigrant communities feel at the consistently dismissive treatment when it comes to equal opportunities, career progression, equal pay, visas, citizenship, and naturalization. The pandemic has taught us that folk who clean bedpans are crucial when the proverbial shite hits the fan. So what should Ireland expect of me? Nothing more than it would expect from its native sons and daughters, that we be law-abiding and that our allegiance be to the Irish flag alone. And what does the adoptive country owe me, an immigrant and an Irish woman? For I am indeed both. It owes me what it owes its other citizens, equality under law and the protection of the Irish flag. Fair is fair, and sure, that's just as it should be.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. We'll move on now to our final speaker on the panel, and then I'll come back and just a few supplementary questions to the panelists, and then I'll open it to the floor. But there's lots of food for thought already in our discussion so far. I'll introduce you now the youngest TD from Galway West. Mairéad Farrell is a TD for Sinn Féin, was elected for the first time last year in 2020. And she has already made a name for herself, I think, for her work in Dáil, especially on financial and economic issues. She's her party's spokesperson for public expenditure and reform, and I know that she has a keen interest in the financial implications and the economic implications of a border poll or a united Ireland. So I'll introduce her to you now and let her do her own talking. Mairéad.
Thanks a million to Ireland's Future for hosting tonight's debate, and I think it's really indicative, and I was listening with interest to the previous speakers, but I think it's really indicative of, you know, the exciting time that we're in relation to this whole conversation regarding Irish unity. And I think with the likes of Brexit and even the likes of COVID and that, we've really moved forward and on, and the whole concept of Irish unity has really become much greater in the debate. And I know that we're kind of, I know Maureen is going to keep us to our time, so I'm going to try and keep my opening remarks short enough, but I want to try and deal with two separate issues, so I mightn't flow exactly from one to the other, but anyway, I'm just trying to keep within the time. So I suppose when we're talking about, and we are at that point now, I suppose, where we are thinking, you know, where the debate on Irish unity really is coming to the forefront. And you know, we can see it from the people in this room. You know, we're still in COVID times, yet we're seeing a really good crowd here tonight who are interested, to the point that they come on a wet, cold Thursday evening out to have this discussion. So I think what we need to look at, you know, what really are the next steps in relation to that. And something that I really feel strongly about is, you know, the Irish government does need to start making, you know, preparations for unity, but how does that really look like? So when we're talking about preparations for Irish unity, obviously what we need to have is really an inclusive debate that brings everyone with all their different points of view included in that debate. It needs to look at the economic arguments, it needs to look at the cultural and social dimensions, and of course the political dynamic. But the key here is that it is as inclusive as possible. And what I really do feel needs to be done in the next steps towards that is the setting up of a National Citizens' Assembly, whereby it gives the opportunity of different voices to come together and have that debate. You know, it gives civic unionism that opportunity to come and have that debate. We saw with the likes of the debate on RTE by Claire Byrne Live, you know, that people are willing to have that conversation. But if we are actually serious about moving that conversation forward, then that is something that we need to have, and that it needs to be as inclusive, of course, as possible. I just want to move kind of, I suppose, to a lot of kind of what Paul was saying is kind of linked to this next part of what I'm saying. And when we're looking at, you know, movement towards Irish unity, and that we need to be looking at the commonality that we actually do have. And I think that the Irish language is really a key part of that commonality. And to go back to that Claire Byrne Live debate, you know, it was quite interesting. A lot of the questions, and then a lot of the questions we hear in general when we're talking about Irish unity is the questions of the flag and the anthem, and Paul, you mentioned those. But what was quite interesting is that something that I hear quite regularly, and it was heard on that particular programme, was the likes of the Irish language terms like Taoiseach and Tánaiste, that, you know, it was seen, I suppose, the way some people would have argued it, and this isn't like to call anyone out, so I'm not going to mention the names, but it was just an interesting thing, but that they felt that this was something that could be a concession to unionism. But really, if we think about it, you know, the language and Irish is, you know, it's not just something that's for nationalists. Like, it really isn't a concession to unionists, because the language is for everyone on this island has a connection to Irish. And I think, in my view, the shared history of language should really be used as a tool to reconciliation. And when we look at the history in that, when we look at the likes of, even if we look at the like the likes of Donegal and the North in general, like it always has had, for a number of reasons, a strong link to Scotland. But one of those key reasons is, of course, was the language, Gaelic. And if you think of Gaelic, what's the word or what's a term in Irish for Gaelic? Gaig and the Halban, just like Gaig and the Moon is the Munster Irish. And I know we were talking earlier about the different dialects. So the reality is that if we go back in history, it's, people use language the most convenient way to communicate. And without question, at one certain point in history, that was undeniably through Irish. And we know even as close as 1833, the Presbyterian General Assembly said, and they described the Irish language as our sweet and memorable mother tongue. And 10 years later, they said that trainee ministers need to have a knowledge of the Irish language because most of the congregations didn't speak English. So I think it's interesting in that whole concept that our shared connection to the Irish language really is a rich part of our culture and should be used to include as many people as possible in building the Ireland going forward. And I think it's quite interesting as well, and I kind of hate on what a number of speakers said, is that we have so many different cultures, but we also have so many different languages in Ireland at the moment. And the idea and the concept of that there's such thing as a monolingual society, that's a completely mythical one. So if we look at Gammon Cant that the traveller community have, Irish sign language, if we look at the languages, different people from different countries. So the language that I would have spoken at home was German. My mother's German. People coming from different countries would have. But I think it's very interesting, and I think just in general, in terms of the whole cultural thing, and in terms of being as inclusive as possible, what we have, and I think this whole attitude even towards the languages, it's nearly that we have a hierarchy of cultures, and we need to move away from that. We need to have an inclusivity, and that it shouldn't relate to languages and cultures in relation to that. We need to be all inclusive, and I think that, in terms of Ireland future, building on that is extremely important, because it isn't that like my language is superior to your language, my culture is superior to your culture. And I think if you want to build a nation, you need to support that multilingualism, and I do think that the indigenous languages of the place also, of course, plays a role. And I think it's quite interesting. I just have a quote here from Linda Irvine, that as a people we are culturally rich, yet instead of embracing that wonderful cultural mix, we separate it into narrow, divisive boxes and deny ourselves access to the very things that make us who they are. So I think the key, and to sum up, is that a united Ireland needs to be a warm home for everyone, and that needs to be inclusive to everyone. And it needs to be for unionists, it needs to be for people from other countries. And I think that the constitutional change that we hope to see, or that I hope to see, that will not threaten anyone's sense of identity.
Thank you, Mairéad. Mairéad Farrell talking to us there. Like I said, I'm going to go back to the panellists now with a question or two, a supplementary question or two based on what they said, and then it's up to the audience here if they'd like to come in and pose their own questions. Fol, I'm coming back to you on the point of Germany, which I thought was interesting, because German reunification happened practically overnight once the Berlin Wall came down. It was seen as a huge achievement, but as you mentioned, 30 years on, there are still huge problems. Probably an indication of a lack of preparedness?
Oh, it absolutely came overnight. Look, I spent 2 years in West Germany in the 1980s and 2 years in East Germany in the 1980s, in the GDR, when it was still there, and then a couple of years in Berlin in the 90s. And really, there was one person in the entire 2 years that I spent in the GDR, which was up until 7 weeks before the wall came down, that said to me, this won't last much longer. And it was one single person of all the people that I engaged with, and it completely stunned me when he said it. So nobody was prepared for it. Nobody was expecting it. West Germany and East Germany had reached some kind of accommodation in the early 1970s. They'd both been recognized, gone into the United Nations and so on. But West Germany had maintained its kind of constitutional definition of Germany as both states, effectively. In the same way, but was calling itself Deutschland.
Yeah, a little like you were describing.
Germany and the
Ireland
DDR
and
was a
Northern
standard
Ireland.
phrase, Deutschland und die DDR, in the same way that you got Ireland and Northern Ireland. So there are so many parallels there, but they certainly weren't prepared for it. And then what they did was they simply annexed. They'd already agreed with the EU that they could basically annex the 5 East German states, recreate the 5 East German states, because they had been abolished in the early 1950s, reunify Berlin, and call the whole thing the Federal Republic with federal laws and so on. And it was so dismissive of the East German experience, because East Germans had grown up in a different system. They had their own childhood. It wasn't all marching to a communist tune morning to night, any more than in the North it wasn't dodging bullets morning to night. We went to Killies, we went to disco. So you have all these personal experiences that people have in a different jurisdiction, in a different political environment, in a different social environment. And to then promote a unification that basically tries to just wipe all that out, that created massive resentment. Now, there are massive economic differences as well between East and West Germany. And I'm not sure I'd have all the expertise to go into that, and it'd probably take us too long. But a lot of the initial economic measures that were introduced by West Germany actually just led to money being pumped into East Germans, which they then spent on Western goods. So it propped up the Western economy far more so than it did the Eastern. There's a lot of things were done wrong there that we can actually learn from in terms of United Ireland. But one of the key things is really that we have to accept that a united country will not simply be the takeover of the smaller by the larger.
And does it also maybe point to the dangers of doing it on the basis of sentimentality? In other words, there was a huge global push to reunite Germany because the Cold War was finishing and this was the end of communism, and we were all celebrating this. But at the end of the day, nobody actually considered Germany, if you know what I mean, while this was being done.
I mean, look, I'm not saying that German unification was a bad thing. I think the way it was done could have been done differently. I wasn't a particular adherent of the partition of Germany any more than I am the partition of Ireland. I think both fundamentally should be overcome, and I'm glad that Germany is united. I just think it was done wrongly. But there's an interesting point in there in terms of the global thing, and I've often felt this about Ireland as well. The impetus to unite Germany didn't actually come from within Germany or within East Germany. The circumstances were created by glasnost and perestroika and the fall of the Soviet Empire. And I think there's a parallel here in that I think the impetus has come from external events here. That has given a movement to United Ireland a new momentum, if you like. One of those was the Brexit vote, and the second thing is that Scotland's slow departure from the UK, and that really will leave the UK looking a little bit half-baked with England and Wales here and this little thing up there, miles and miles away, sandwiched between independent Scotland and independent Republic of Ireland, which I don't think is going to be sustainable. I don't think the English will have much interest in it anymore, any more than the Russians had much interest in East Germany once the Soviet Empire was falling. So I think there are certain external factors that we shouldn't forget either. But nevertheless, I think the social and the cultural circumstances and the political circumstances in which you achieve unification, there are things to be learned from Germany in terms of what not to do, and probably a small few things about what to do as well, in fairness.
The final question I'll ask you is, as somebody who speaks Gaeilge, Galifa, Mairéad's point there about the language has been politicised a lot in the case of Northern Ireland, unfortunately, and has been grasped onto by both communities.
Yeah.
And
So
it's a pity because it could be a unifying factor.
It could be a unifying factor, and you look at the work that Linda Irvine is doing, and that's fantastic. And you look at the history of it, Padraig O'Snoddy's book, Hidden Ulster, around the fact that, and Mairéad alluded to that Presbyterians in, for example, Saintfield, Tunnaneve Presbyterian Church, Townach Nave, just outside Belfast, and it was called Tunnaneve because a lot of the first Presbyterians were native Irish converts. There's this myth that the Unionists are all English and Scottish settlers. Quite a lot of them are actually native Irish converts. In fact, my own surname, Doherty, is 99% Catholic in every county in Ireland except County Antrim, where it's 34% Protestant, in the 1911 census. So there are a lot of native Irish converts, but we can also romanticize that a little bit, And I mean, that whole business about, the that Mairéad alluded to, the Presbyterians wanting their ministers to learn Irish. Some of the research would suggest that's because they wanted them to be able to proselytize.
To convert.
It wasn't for any love of the language, frankly, So I think we do need to be careful. And the other thing is there's another language to consider in the middle of all this, and I know there's a lot of cynicism around it in nationalist circles, and in fact, my old Presbyterian neighbour in South Antrim was a deep cynic about Ulster Scots, and he was steeped in Presbyterian tradition. But nevertheless, there is a tradition there, there's a heritage there. Whether it's a living, functional modern language is another debate You can have your view on that. I don't think it has evolved in that way. But it is a really strong cultural heritage that stretches from the speeches of Ian Paisley to the poetry of Seamus Heaney and lots of stuff in between. And I, for one, am absolutely proud that the Irish passport at the present time has poetry not only in Irish and English, but also in Ulster Scots in its pages, that beautifully designed passport. So I do think that there is definitely a linguistic point there, that we need to depoliticize the language. We need to be wary of people engaging in whataboutery around the language. But it's not just Irish that is there for all of us, it's Ulster Scots as well.
Indeed, indeed. Ibrahim, I noted that you mentioned your experiences while in Wales and in Britain of discrimination, of anti-Irishness, and that kind of influenced your thinking a little. And you mentioned that we should be open and inclusive. As a society, Ireland was not open and inclusive to anyone until maybe the last 20 years. That was a problem that we had in general. Would you agree with that?
Well, to a degree, I would agree with it. But I do remember my youth very much growing up in Ireland. I mean, I spent all my life in Ireland before I moved over to study in the United Kingdom, really in my late teens. But I do remember spending all my time, I spent a lot of my time in Cork, where my family were in Cork. And I didn't see that part of Ireland. I saw a very, very friendly Ireland, a very open Ireland, a very accommodating Ireland. The Irish people at that time were hospitable. They didn't treat anyone that I saw differently. I only really saw it when I moved to the UK. And it wasn't something that took a long time for me to see. It happened more or less immediately.
It's blatant.
The moment I spoke, the Irish accent came out. Unfortunately, I was living as a student and living in UK during the time of when the last kind of campaigns of the IRA or whatever were happening, and every time an explosion would happen, a bomb would go off, every Irish person at that time would just go zoom. We would just keep quiet, because we knew we were going to get something. We were going to get some kind of taunting or insulting or whatever. And I had a very close friend, and she still is a very close friend, who was caught up in one of those bombings in London, London Bridge, where she unfortunately sustained some injuries in her face. And that had a very profound effect upon me, as far as the hatred that came from her for me then, being Irish. And so I think what I learned when I was there was that not all English people hated Irish people. There was obviously that element as well. There were some amazing people in England. I learned that very quickly. But I also saw a lot of other prejudice, not just towards the Irish, but others in while I was there. So that had you're right, that had a very impact upon me when I came back to Ireland. I remember the first thing I saw when I came back to Ireland, in my first trip when I was considering moving back to Ireland, was in 1998, when I saw a poster in Dublin for March for Anti-Racism. And I was shocked when I saw that, because I thought, has Ireland changed that much, that now there's marches for anti-racism? Ireland was never, for me, that kind of a country.
You've
so
never
I can't say that
racism in an Irish context before.
Yeah, I can't say that. It was a big surprise to me. But I have to say, when I came here, I did see certain things, which obviously my experience in London and UK helped me to, I suppose, try to forge some kind of efforts in Ireland that those Irish people who had that prejudice towards others, they need to remove that. Because we were people that were oppressed in England, or oppressed means the comments, the sarcasm, the prejudice shouldn't be here in this country. We're a nation that have been through all that, and including that was including the north as well, Northern Ireland. I mean, I spent a lot of time there as well, where you were always walking around, being careful which street you were walking into, which chipper you were going to buy something from, and that was a terrible thing to go through.
But has that gone away? Do you think? Do you think that has gone away? People don't. I know that when I first started going to Northern Ireland as a journalist, I wouldn't call myself a journalist, as a broadcaster, I used to look at the footpaths, at the colours painted on the footpaths, and that would judge me where I'd stop for petrol or because I just had an unregistered car.
I think there's a huge difference now. Northern Ireland right now is great to an extent. I mean, to an extent, there's always those fragmentations there. but it is great. You can walk around Northern Ireland and feel reasonably safe. But that said, there are those elements there. There's still those fragmentations there towards sectarianism, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I'll just share this with you very quickly. It's when I went into a chipper one day with a friend of mine from the United Kingdom, and it was in a very hardcore loyalist area. And I didn't realize when I walked into the chipper that's what it was. And I said to my friend, "You better order the food for me." And he said, "Why?" Because I have a Southern Irish accent, they might say something to me. And but it was very fine when the conversation started. They were very open and very happy about it. So Ireland, I think it is changed up there, but there's a lot of work still to happen. It's a lot of work. Yeah.
I had an incident years ago. I had travelled to Derry. We had gone up for a weekend to Derry, myself and my husband. And at the end of the night, we were looking for a taxi to go back into the city centre. We'd had a few drinks in the Bogside Inn, looking at the fabulous photos on the wall from historic times. But a young couple came into it's kind of a shipping thing, whatever you'd call it. Anyways, I said we were going to wherever we were going, and then the young lad said, we're looking for a taxi to go to the waterside. And the girl goes, "Don't be saying that, they'll think we're Protestants." Because there had been an upsurge in nationalists building and buying houses on the waterside of Derry. So it's still a little bit in the psyche, unfortunately. People think of the divisions. And maybe, Movery, that's what I noticed most of your speech. You were calling yourself an immigrant. Immigrants in Ireland have found it notoriously difficult, but of course the Irish as immigrants found it notoriously difficult while we were travelling the world, not only to Britain. I mean, we went to America. We now say we ran America and we built America and this, that and the other, but we were treated shamefully there as well when we went there. An immigrant's lot is never a very easy one.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with you. An immigrant's lot is not an easy one because you're constantly trying to juggle, two things. You're trying to juggle the culture of where you came from, and with trying to assimilate and integrate, and it can be hard. It can be quite hard.
And I notice, you say a hangover from colonialism, and that hangover can last for generations, as you said. And I enjoyed the story about your daughter and the First Communion. At least we're not Protestants. The way that was still so deeply ingrained in the Irish psyche, and it still is. Really.
Yeah, imagine for a 7-year-old to have picked that up in class. It was quite. To me, it was funny and shocking both.
But your experience here in Ireland, I mentioned it there to Ibrahim. Ireland in the last, I said 20 years, maybe in the last 10 years, socially has changed completely. Yeah. And we have become more open and accepting, I think, and it is easier now, apart from the vagaries of the systems and direct provision and things like that, for people to come to the country.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. I mean, we wouldn't have stayed on in Ireland if we weren't happy, and if we didn't feel that this was, home for us, or if we didn't feel comfortable enough to make it our home. So yes, Ireland has changed hugely, and every time I talk to any of my non-Irish friends or outside Ireland, if I'm in India and I'm talking to people in India, or to friends in America, for example, I'm always full of pride that we were the first country in the world to accept and legalize same-sex marriage by referendum, by public referendum. That's such an amazing thing, such an absolutely amazing thing. And every stride that we have made, whether it is, legalizing abortion, or whether it is same-sex marriage, divorce, bringing in the first country to bring in the plastic bags, first country to bring in the smoking thing. Yes. I mean, how many firsts have we had? It's actually just quite amazing, to think of where we were even 30 years ago. When I first came to Ireland, people ask me very often, "Did you have a culture shock?" And I always say, "Yeah, but it was in reverse." Because we came to Ireland thinking, "Oh my God, we are heading west. It's going to be sex, drugs, rock and roll." And then we came to Sligo
30 years ago.
It was such a conservative country. So, for a country so conservative, And, you know, whatever your politics might be, I remember with so much of pride that the fact that Leo Varadkar was half Indian, oh, never mind Indian, just half Irish and gay, never was a bone of contention during the election. It only became something to talk about after he was elected, and that too by the world's media, not in Ireland. Like, isn't that amazing? That didn't even figure, you know, in the campaign. I mean, there was not one party that stood up and said, "Don't go for him. You know, he's like only half Irish." Nobody said that. You know, like not even in passing. So it's really a matter of pride, I think, and I think so. I'm absolutely so proud.
Mairéad, as the only politician here tonight, or the only elected politician, you're talking about a citizens' assembly, and I think most people would believe at this stage that some kind of a forum for discussion needs to take place, because, you know, there are questions, and some people regard them as trivial, like the flag or the national anthem, and then there are much more basic things like identity, as Paul said, and also, can we afford this?
I think it'll be interesting, you know, as the discussion moves on, what actually will come up. And there'll be something that none of us think of, and it'll end up becoming the key issue. Do you know, the way these things often are.
To unite the soccer teams.
It could be anything, like, you know, and it'll be something that we don't think of, and it'll take the, you know, the kind of people's minds in that. But I suppose one thing that really does come up quite a lot is that whole issue of, like, can we afford it? And this whole, you know, concept of this subvention, and the figure that's bandied about is like, oh, this is 10 billion, we'll never be able to afford the North. How are we going to do this? There's no way we can do it.
Barnett formula
and like, I was saying this to Paul previously, but, you know, I'll never forget, I was at my friend's birthday party, and, you know, she's not political, and I was, you know, I'm her good friend, and I was at the birthday party, and two people started having this conversation, oh, we can't afford a United Ireland, and I just had to do everything in my might not to get, like, heavily involved in this conversation for my friend's sake, because it was her other friends. But it's quite an interesting one. So I suppose what people often say is this whole concept of that, you know, this 10 billion subvention, how will we ever do it? But really, this whole concept of the 10 billion, really more than anything, is quite a mythical number. So first of all, for example, like, I could go into all the figures, but then I'll probably lose everyone. But anyway, the you know, so the whole thing of the corporation tax, for example, isn't included in that. So that's, say, 500 million. So basically, that, because of what it actually is, it'll bring it about down to 9 billion. Then there's the whole concept of the pensions, and that was something that, you know, in the Scottish debate, it was very clear the British government said that would fall under them. And then there's the fact that, you know, obviously part of that is even, you know, money towards, you know, British Army, overseas aid, debt, all that kind of thing. And really, and truthfully, you know, if you look at it, it could be as low as 2.5 billion. So that's the whole subvention thing. And you know, there's detailed analysis and all that kind of thing. And I'm not expecting everyone to just memorize this now and go out and say it. But the other thing is, if you look at it, you know, this island, like, we didn't fulfill our economic potential. Like, you know, with the fact that we have a situation where we have two currencies, two sets of lots of different things. You know, we've doubling up of, like, public services not jointly working together, and all those things. And it's meant really that, you know, there's been periphery status, and we can see that in that, you know, the northwestern area, you know, the way that's now been designated kind of periphery status within the context of the EU, because, you know, it has fallen short. We see it in the fact that, you know, that in the north, you know, there's a very high percentage of really low paid work and all that kind of thing. So we haven't fulfilled our economic potential. I think that seeing a united Ireland, you know, bringing all that together, not having that doubling up of the services, not having that, you know, doubling up of everything, and really working together, that we can really have, you know, that we will build on our economy. And I think that's, a lot of people would have that kind of shared view. And we now know that a lot of different economists like Kurt Hubner, David McWilliams, and even the ESRI are looking at that. So I think, you know, that really has changed, you know, people's views in relation to that.
And I noticed that you said very little about Europe or Brexit there, but I mean, I know I was working in Scotland when the independence debate was going on, 2014, and I know that was one of the things that swayed the Scottish population, because José Manuel Barroso said at the time, you will not be able to apply again for membership of the EU if you vote for independence. So stay in the UK and you get to stay in the EU. That's all blown out of the water now.
Isn't it funny? I do actually think that's so, you know, it's so obvious in the sense that that was a huge thing.
It was.
And that's what I mean, even when I say, like, who knows what the conversation, what the big thing will be with this conversation, but that's why we need to have the conversation so we can look at all those issues. But that was a big thing with the Scottish referendum, and I remember that. But now we're you know, it's a totally different concept now because of Brexit, which is bizarre in itself, but, you know, that's where it's at, and it is quite interesting. Sorry.
And it probably will be an influence if we had, if it would
Oh,
be.
it would, yeah, I would imagine.
Tomorrow morning, if there were a border poll, there would be a lot of the unionist population who would say, well, you know, that maybe it is in our interest to unite with them, not for any reason except that we'll be within the European Union again.
Well, it could, I would imagine it could be for different people in general, and it could be something, I suppose, even that other people would then feel. But it is interesting in itself, I think, that it wasn't something that for Scotland, and then it is something for ourselves, the kind of juxtaposition of that. But I even just think it's very interesting what Paul was saying there in relation to, my mother's from Berlin, and just the whole concept of, you know, we can't do what Germany did. I think that's very important. And even just up to recently, I can't say for sure now, but my mother's friend was working as a cop in East Germany, and she was being paid less than cops in West Germany, although it was state paid. You know, one thing we don't want is that on one part of the island that people are paid less in state jobs because
the NHS is a big...
Yeah, and the NHS is a massive thing, and I totally understand people's concerns in relation to that. But what we need to see, and what we need to be realistic about as well, is that Tories have cut and cut and cut, and the NHS isn't what it used to be either. And, you know, what we see in the south is that we see, like, the per capita spend on health is way above most countries, but the reality is the service is so poor. So what we need to be looking, and I totally understand if people, you know, that people would have that concern in relation to the NHS, but what we're seeing more and more is that because of individual actions, and not because of an overarching policy, but because of individual actions, and again, this was an interesting report by the ESRI, by Dr. Deirdre Heenan, I think, in relation to that, there has been some work, you know, cross-border in terms of our health system. But what we need actually is an all-Ireland approach in relation to that, to build an Irish National Health Service that actually delivers for people.
I think we'll open to the floor at this stage. I'm very grateful to the 4 panellists for sharing their views with us. Jerry has a microphone there, so he will go to you. And if you could just give us your name, I'm not going to say and your organisation, but just your name so that we're familiar with you when you start. So I know I recognise Margareta, so I'll let her speak first, and then I'll go to you, sir, just behind her. Now, there's a microphone there for you, Margareta.
Okay, I come from Raging Grannies. And really what I want to put to you all, and to myself, is what is our position inside the rest of the world? On the one hand, we are meant to be neutral, but our neutrality is of a very ambiguous kind. I mean, Simon Coveney got us placed at the United Nations because he said we were neutral. Now, we know that actually we are not neutral. Is that we support wars. At the moment, we have Irish troops in Mali, we've had in Afghanistan. I'm not going to talk about Shannon and the enormous amount of planes that have actually bombed half the world. And what is going to happen in the north? The north is part of NATO. Ireland were part of PESCO. And so I think I would like our panel to maybe consider, because it's not an easy subject that we can actually debate or have a view on now. I think we should bring it to the Citizens' Assembly. Now, I believe that it wasn't allowed to be debated at the Citizens' Assembly, but I do feel our foreign policy, where we are in the world, do we feel comfortable in the world with the kind of foreign policy that we have? Thank you.
Now, Jorge, on that issue, our foreign policy, our defence policy, I suppose. I don't know if anyone has anything in particular to say, but either of you like to come in there?
I think it actually, it's a very interesting point, Margaret, and I think, I would share your views in relation to that, but I think it again shows the questions that could and would be debated in a citizens' assembly, hence why the importance of actually having these debates. I have my views, other people in the panel might have different views or the same views, I have no idea. But the point is, we need to have those conversations, because absolutely you're 100% on the mark in what you're saying. But that's where
of course, we haven't been neutral in quite a long time. We're officially non-aligned, even though we claim to be neutral. There's a gentleman there. Sorry, Hover, you wanted to come in? Sure.
Yeah. Margarita, I actually think this is such a typical, Irish solution to an Irish problem, because we have never been neutral, not for hundreds of years. Irishmen have served in every blooming war that there's ever been. And we've just kind of ignored it and then pretended to be neutral. So, as Mairéad said, that conversation just has to be had. And I think the state of the world today and all the dangers we face, it's morally wrong to be neutral. That's what I feel.
Can I just say?
Sure, Ibrahim.
I think, one of the things for me is regarding foreign policies, is that what we observe is that the greater, more powerful countries do not do justice and act upon justice at all. In my personal opinion, the United Nations as an institution has been failing for quite a long time, not being able to put its foot down on certain countries who are transgressing against smaller countries or weaker countries, or those countries which oppress other countries. That's where I think foreign policy is failing in many countries. I think what's interesting is that Ireland, now being part of the Security Council, has a huge role now and a huge opportunity. Even though we're a small country, but we are a people who have known oppression. We have known these things. Mm-hmm. We have felt it. We've been under that. We know what it's like for others to suffer. So I think Ireland has a huge opportunity to challenge certain foreign policies and to speak up against them, not in a way being aggressive, but in against of justice. I think that's what I would like to see in foreign policy in this country, that no matter how big that country is, no matter how powerful that country is, whether that's sending funding into certain countries, it is about someone demanding answers to questions that are not being answered. That's what that's the one I'd like to see in foreign policy.
Thank you, Ibrahim. This gentleman with the glasses, Jerry, the second with the light shirt there.
Thank you. Mark Lowen is my name. I find the discussion fascinating. I want to thank the panel. It's very informative. And as a former Irish immigrant in the United States, the comments from the panel resonate very much with me about the need for diversity and inclusivity. And I think that's coming in strongly. I know I came back to an Ireland that was a lot more diverse, and we're better off for it. And I think there's probably not a person in this room who hasn't had that experience, or their family hasn't had it. And it's good that we have that generosity of spirit and that we celebrate that diversity. It's important for us. But my question is around, I think I have two questions on the comments you've been making on, in order to ensure that all the children of the nation are cherished equally in this new republic, what specifically do you see that we could protect those with other identities? How do we protect that unionist and British identity practically? How do you think that? And secondly, something that I've heard said is that unionism will rise up in armed conflict against the new republic. And what are the panel's views on that issue? Thank you.
Paul, I'll come to you on the question of identity. You said in your opening remarks that our identity has become a very diverse situation now in this country in comparison to what it used to be. But there is always going to be that core element. that will neither accept either side. But do you think we're nearly ready? Do you think we're nearly there in as far as that we're much more open, that we're much more diverse, that we are accepting, and that there are things that can be done now to ensure that all the children of the nation are cherished equally?
I think there are things that can be done. As I said earlier, we're never going to get complete agreement from Unionists to United Ireland, but I don't think it should be a Unionist veto. I think it was, from a Republican perspective, from a nationalist perspective, it was a massive concession to accept a Northern veto in the 1998 agreement. But some of the seeds of what we can be done are actually within the Good Friday Agreement. And much as mandatory coalition is something that I don't think should ever be a permanent solution in a democracy, there are other elements of that agreement, such as the right of anybody in the North to regard themselves as Irish or British or both, and to get both passports. That absolutely must pass into any future political settlement. I would almost go one further, and this is a thought that just came to me today as I was reflecting on this. If you look at the old, and maybe Ireland's too small to do this, but maybe it isn't, maybe size isn't the issue. In the Soviet Union, you had a clear distinction between citizenship and nationality. And maybe Ireland could therefore actually issue Irish passports where, and the UK might think about doing this as well, where whilst your citizenship is Ireland, you could declare what your nationality is, and it need not necessarily be Irish as such. And therefore you could have someone from Sandy Row or the Shankill Road or whatever, basically saying, yes, I'm happy to take an Irish passport, that is my citizenship, but I am declaring on that passport that my nationality is British.
But equally people from
and by the way, that
could
British,
that.
no, sorry?
Equally people from Belarus could do that, or from Latvia, or from...
Correct, So on an Irish passport, absolutely. And that I think could be absolutely legitimate. But specifically in respect of the Unionists, for example, in the North, one thing that's often forgotten, and I think they've forgotten themselves, frankly, and certainly in Britain they've forgotten it, they were actually the first modern Brits. When King James VI of Scotland became King James I of England, he wanted to be King of Great Britain. He proposed that England and Scotland be merged and be called Great Britain. The Parliament in London said, thanks, but no thanks, Jimmy. And the Parliament in Edinburgh said exactly the same thing, thanks, but no thanks, Jimmy. So for another 100 years, in Britain you had Englishmen and Scotsmen. Wales had been absorbed into England against its will. So there were Englishmen and Scotsmen. There weren't actually any Brits. That came in the 18th century, in the 1700s. But on the plantation of Ulster, from 1608 onwards, the planters, a mixture of English and Scottish settlers and native Irish converts, were being called British. So for me, that British identity precedes the United Kingdom and will survive the United Kingdom as well. But it's a question of how we actually then facilitate that in Irish civic society and Irish civic life.
Ibrahim, what would you say that we need to do to ensure that all the children of the nation are being cherished equally?
Sorry.
The gentleman asked, what do we need to do practically to ensure that all the children of the nation are cherished equally, as is written in the proclamation in 1916?
I think the first thing we have to do is listen to what the children say. That's where we begin. Because any nation's future is the future of the children. And why I think that's important is because our generation and generations before us have been debating and arguing and coming up with all sides of concepts of what should happen and what should be taking place. Rather, what we should be doing is listening to those who are born, reared on the island of Ireland, and that includes north of Ireland. It is what do the children say? What did that generation say now? What they want? I think that is one thing. But I think that, for me at least, anyone born on the island of Ireland is Irish. I can't see how you escape that in one way or another. I know that was mentioned about the Ulster plantations and the planters and the Scottish and etc. And that's fine. That's there. That's written in history. But essentially, the people born on this island were Irish, and they'll always. It's Ireland. It's era. It's has that been that way. So I think that those children, that generation who are up there right now, there's a lot of teenagers that I've met in the North, because I go there a lot, because I'm not responsible for Ireland, the Republic, I'm also responsible for Northern Ireland as well, as an Imam, as a missionary. And I've met a lot of teenagers who are from Protestant background, Presbyterian background, and they see themselves as Irish. Now, some might say now, Northern Irish. But the point is they see themselves as Irish. They don't see themselves as being part of mainland UK. I think that's a very important area that can be worked upon, maybe to build further bridges to help a United Ireland to develop.
I noticed there, Fol, that you took notes while Ibrahim was speaking.
Yeah, so I would disagree with Ibrahim in one respect. I think it's perfectly legitimate to represent the viewpoint that everyone born in Ireland is Irish. But the fact is that there are some who were born in Ireland, their ancestry is Irish, is in Ireland, shall we say, and of Ireland, generations back, centuries back. Some of them actually never came from Britain. If to go by the surnames, their ancestors have been in Ireland for 2 millennia, but they do not regard themselves as Irish. And we have got to protect their right not to regard themselves as Irish. That has to be part of the new United Ireland. So that's where I balk at the expression, everyone born in Ireland is Irish. Yes, that is the ideal, perhaps, and certainly you would never deny anyone born in Ireland, in my view, the right to regard themselves as Irish. But the fact is that some do not, and we've got to respect that as well.
I accept that, yeah.
And
Calvary, I want to bring you in here because you have children who were born in Ireland to Indian parents.
Yeah.
Do they regard themselves as anything but Irish?
Totally Irish. I mean, if somebody asked them, they would say, "Oh, we're from Kildare. Our parents came from India."
Yeah.
That would be the combination. But just to answer your question, I really think since this whole exercise is about thinking ahead, I really strongly believe in the Educate Together schools. And I think if there's more emphasis placed on more of those kind of schools, children who grow up together of every faith, I am telling you, they have immense respect for differences. If you have grown up with somebody and studied with them and, played with them and, had all kinds of escapades with them, you will forever be able to understand their point of view. Do you mind if I have a quote here that I actually just thought was so relevant to this. It's a quote from, it's something that Mahatma Gandhi said. He said, "Your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits then become your values, and your values become your destiny." And I think that applies to a country as much as it would to an individual. So I think if we are able to, get children to believe in respecting differences, I know it sounds so, sort of pie in the sky, but actually that's what Educate Together schools do. And I really think that in part of this debate should be, how do we encourage children to study together?
That was, of course, one of the big failings in Northern Ireland, even since the Good Friday Agreement. There is still such a huge divide in the education system. Very little integrated education, which could, I suppose, help a lot in making society more integrated.
Yes, absolutely. And just to, as well, go back to the actual question in relation to how do we protect identities, and it's gone back to a few things that have been said. I suppose, firstly, Paul, you had mentioned, Ulster Scots, and the reality is, in such a new united Ireland, all languages would need to be protected, all identities would need to be protected, all languages would need to be protected under law. Like multilingualism and multiculturalism will be absolutely key. And I think as well, in terms of identity, under the Good Friday Agreement, it's very clear. People can identify British, they can identify Irish, they can identify both, and that would absolutely need to be protected going forward. So I think in those senses, there are two key aspects in terms of ensuring that, that all identities are actually protected. And of course, obviously, actually including unionists in the debate and allowing for that broader discussion will be key to that. But I think...
And what do we do, you know, if something happens like happened when Enda Kenny invited the DUP to come to a conference in Dublin post-Brexit and they refused to come, what do we do if this conversation is started by, say, 70% of the population, and then there's a 20% who are kind of non-committal, but that there is this rump, this core, who say, no, we will not partake?
Well, I suppose
we don't want to hear it. And Jeffrey Donaldson repeated it again this week, that there will not be a United Ireland in his lifetime.
Well, look, I think what we've heard really today is that clearly there's going to be people who aren't ever going to be in favour of a United Ireland. And look, that's their viewpoint and they're totally entitled to that viewpoint. What we need to make sure is that all those who would like to engage in that debate, that they actually have the platform to do so, that they have the ability to do so. At this moment in time, do I really think that that's the case? No, I don't. I think this particular, you know, the whole thing of Ireland's future and the work they're doing absolutely is working on that. But we need this on a much bigger scale. And we need, so we need to be as inclusive as possible. So we're hearing the different viewpoints, that we're giving unionism the opportunity to make their viewpoints and make that very clearly, and their particular concerns. But I do think, going back just that, I thought that Clare Live, you know, Clare Byrne Live, it was very clear that there was plenty of people who, you know, unionists who did want to have that, conversation, outline very clearly why, you know, they don't want a united Ireland, as is their right to do so. And sure, maybe we'll see that now on Shot Law or TG Carr.
Hardly.
You'll host a debate next.
Hardly. Anyone else like to speak? Go on. Just hear Jerry, the young man with the black mask, is taken off.
Cheers, thanks.
You just give us your name first.
Oh yeah, Adrian Curran is my name. So I guess I sort of have a thought I'd like to maybe get the speaker's thoughts on, more so than like a direct question, if that's okay. So I suppose to start with, I'm absolutely in favour of ending partition, and I think we are moving in that direction. I think it's a very exciting opportunity, you know, to really reshape Ireland. I think James Connolly was right when he said partition would be a carnival of reaction, and that's what happened on both sides of the border. You know, in the north, we have a sectarian state that is sectarian to the very core of its institutions, with Stormont and so on, and in the south, we have, you know, a neoliberal tax haven with record homelessness and record hospital waiting lists, and, you know, my entire generation practically priced out of housing, you know, and I could go on, direct provision, shameful treatment of travellers throughout, you know, decades, centuries. So I guess I would like to see an emphasis on not just United Ireland, but like a new Ireland, as it says behind you there, where, you know, it works for the many, you know, not the few, the people of Ireland from all backgrounds, and, you know, people who come to Ireland from abroad and everything. I think if we are, which I think we are, moving towards ending partition, that I think we need to take that opportunity to really reshape Irish society for the better and make it a fairer, more equal, more inclusive place, you know, and not just sort of county, you know, neoliberal tax haven, as I said earlier, that we have in the south currently, you know. Thanks.
This probably goes back to your point, Fol, about the northern state being subsumed into the southern state rather than actually creating a new Ireland. Are we ready to do that, though? I find people say, oh, I'd love a united Ireland, but very few people have actually thought about what it means.
There is a massive amount of work to be done on it. By the way, the phrase New Ireland, I discovered, was, I don't know, it was coined by, but it was used by Gareth Fitzgerald in 1973 as part of an agenda at the time. I can't remember exactly what the agenda was. I was probably too young. But there is a load of work to be done. And I mean, even if I think of the education sector, and since I'm straying into the education sector, I'll just clarify I'm here as myself, not as any official role. But you look at, even when you set Leaving Cert beside A-levels and the different approaches to how, whether teenagers start focusing narrowly on a small number of subjects when they're 16 going to A-levels, or keep it broad. The complaints that you hear regularly about rote learning rather than developing critical thinking, and I think it's a bit more developed in A-level, but not much more than in Leaving Cert. So there, and then, of course, what that does in terms of whether you get the equivalencies right and so on. Are you facilitating mobility across the border, the different fees regimes and so on?
And then there's the brain drain, of course, of young people leaving the north to go to Britain, to university.
Leaving the north to go to Britain, but there's also, frankly, a brain drain here, because we have a very high, we have the fifth highest percentage of, fifth highest participation rate in higher education in the world. And one of the questions is then, is there merit in actually developing a broader range of options for school leavers? Because, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, but are we exporting graduates and importing tradesmen? And actually, and I've nothing against mobility. That's not a point against mobility, and I wouldn't like to see it hijacked by anyone in that regard. But it is about whether we're investing properly in the range of possibilities for our young people. And you know, that mobility point, like when I lectured in the north in the 90s, I had students coming all the way to Coleraine and Derry from Clonakilty and Skibbereen and the Ring in Waterford and West Clare. And then suddenly the regime changed where there was no fees in the south and there were small fees in the north, dried up. A couple of years later, they put equivalencies in that meant that basically to get the top points courses south of the border with A-levels, you had to be Albert Einstein. And the numbers vastly reduced that were traveling south. So that's just one area where I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of creating a new structure, a new system that might be fit for purpose and might actually create some kind of unity around it. And that's before we even get into economics, social, God knows what else.
I mean, your husband, Movery, came here as a junior doctor, and I mean, you would know the health system, and that it's 20 years since a dyed-in-the-wool Republican in West Belfast told me the biggest problem you will have convincing the nationalist population to vote for United Ireland is the health service, and we touched on it earlier. The NHS in Britain, even though it's been downgraded and hasn't been invested in properly, people are worried about their NHS.
Yeah, and you can understand because, you know, at the moment in Ireland, I know that whole classes of qualified doctors are heading off to Australia, you know. And we have such a desperate situation in our health service. It's, you know, you wouldn't even know where to begin in terms of recruitment, retaining staff, training staff, paying them well. You know, all the foreign doctors that come, they're all on 6-month contracts. They have to move every 6 months. They have to reapply for visas every 6 months. I mean, these are people who are keeping the system going. You know, surely there should be some joint up thinking. So, you know, if the situation is so bad, it's only going to get worse. I can quite understand why people are anxious not to give up the NHS in the north. You know.
Sinn Féin are always saying, Mairéad, that you want a new Ireland, as in we go back to the beginning and we start again at the drawing board, rather than just unite the 6 with the 26.
I think that's very important. On what we touched on earlier and the way, like, it didn't, you know, the way it happened in Germany and that, but I do think that's very important. I mean, if we are talking about being inclusive, if we're talking about respecting all identities, etc., like, you know, we will be needing to go back to the drawing board and we will need to be envisaging a new Ireland that, and I didn't realise that it was Gareth Fitzgerald who started that. But anyway, I'll keep using it because most people, he, you know, he isn't that famous for saying it. But, you know, if we are looking at a new Ireland, you know, obviously when we're building a new Ireland, we will need to look at things. And I actually think, and I think Adrian makes a really good point in relation to all this, and how many people have huge difficulties in this society currently because of the way it's structured. But I think when we get to the point where it really is a conversation, and I suppose, you know, when we're building up to a referendum and all those things, when it really is a conversation, I think people will actually stop and say, right, what do I want from the place that I live? What basic needs do I think are extremely important? I think it'll actually open a different kind of political discussion that we probably haven't really seen, and I think that'll be very interesting. I mean, I have my own views, and people in this room will all have different views. The point is, we're going to be coming together and shaping that society. So it's not just going to be what myself or Sinn Féin are saying, but it will be very interesting, I think, to see what people say. Well, do you know what? I don't like how this is done, or we need more focus in relation to that. And I just think it could actually politicise people in general. It's, you know, really, I think it could be quite an exciting time.
Ibrahim, do we need to do that north of the border as well? Do people up there need to be encouraged to look at this in a broader way, rather than nationalist, unionist, Irish, British, to look at the opportunities to reshape the society up there, which was, I mean, nobody can deny it, it was for many, many years a sectarian state. And it was designed to be as such, and therefore left one side of the population feeling hard done by constantly, and another side in power.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's going to take time, and a long time probably. There has been so many generations growing up there during the time of the Troubles, and their mindsets and their ideologies and their concepts, and then the new generations have come in 3 or 4 or 5 generations down who've lived in Northern Ireland without seeing any of those Troubles. The education is a huge issue, and I agree with that. It is going to take a long time to assimilate or to come up with something new, something that everyone will agree upon. There will be a lot of work to be done, in my opinion. There will be to assimilate everyone, and everyone's happy with the structure that's going to develop. But of course, at some point, if and I would hope and I believe that a United Ireland will happen, then there's going to have to be a lot of work to be done together from both sides to work with each other. It might take some generations for it eventually to unify in every sense of the word, whether that's education, health, the police forces, etc., etc. But I think it will take time. But again, as I mentioned earlier on, it is the youth, the young people are the ones who will bring about that change.
Anyone else on the floor who'd like to come in? This gentleman here with the yellow. The microphone's on its way.
Hi, Brendan Duffy. I just, as somebody who's probably an immigrant from the north myself, down to here in Galway, over 30 years, I've still family live up in Northern Ireland, Antrim, Belfast, etc. And the whole thing about integrated schools, as we say, is the thing. There are as many integrated schools in Northern Ireland as there are here in the 26 counties. The fact is, with schools up there, that now, as I see with my family up there, that some send, and each and I have friends on both sides of loyalism and republicanism, that they send their children to the school of choice because of the quality of the school. We have Protestant children who go to Catholic schools, Catholic children who go to Protestant schools. So, to kind of point that finger is really a fallacy. The other end is saying the National Health Service. The only difference is, and again it's for family experience, is you pay €50 here for the doctor. In Northern Ireland, currently at the minute, you'll wait 6 weeks to see the doctor. You could be dead by then. So, and prescriptions is another thing that you pay or don't pay for. On the other end, I'm disappointed here that we have, in government for over 100 years, 2 parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and their sister parties, Labour and the Greens, who don't sit here tonight. And they are the ones, we talk about bringing on unionism. I see my family who work on the ground as political activists, and they work with unionists, loyalists. When we moved to Antrim first, a really Protestant town, by all accounts, that there had to be called. They had the arches up, they had their marches for like the whole of July, August, etc. Nowadays, they sit down with their niceness neighbours, and they plan and they agree when they can have the arch up, the flags up, when they march, and the same, and they end with republicanism. But going back to the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael not being here, these are people who have a lot to lose if we get a united Ireland, not a shared Ireland, because again, they've taken the word united and changed it like they did when we had the war, the Second World War, they called it the emergency. When we had the war in the 6 counties, they called it the Troubles. A shared island is what we have now. And that is an island, an Ireland, where people have untold wealth. And we have other people who are sitting, children, eating their dinner off a paper plate. So we got to bring them on board. Unionism is going to be the easiest ones by the looks of what we can see. Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, their sister parties, Labour and Greens, they will be the ones we'll have to work on, because they have the most to lose when they will lose their political entities and their power. And this is what they know, and that's why they use words. I'm quite happy to see the Citizens' Assembly taking this on board, because they've done good work before. But I hope that they take on board what is presented to them, not like they have done in some cases and tried to water it down. So as much as we talk, it's a great forum. We need to have, sitting here at these tables, the local representatives of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and hear their views. A few years ago, as part of what we do here, we had talks, and we invited Eamon O'Keefe, who, unfortunately, I know Eamon, and he's not here tonight, But he was stopped coming talking for a similar subject about 5 years ago. We tried to organise this type of a talk by his Corlick Hunter, because they seen that as cowtown. Now we got to change that mindset, and as I say, whatever we talk about unionism, we got to start here and change the outlook of these people who have a political career that they don't want undermined by people being united. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, quickly, Mairéad, because I want to bring up.
I might just come in on that because, I totally agree. We'll need to bring everyone on board. But I should have said earlier, and I know Maureen gave Eamon's apologies, but he also contacted me and he said that unfortunately it was completely unavoidable and he had been looking forward to it. I know that from the organisational meeting we had in relation to that, and I suppose it'll be interesting. I think it is interesting to see, what the likes of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have, and how there is some interest in it. And I think a lot of that is as well because there is growing momentum. And because I'm the only person from a political party here, I was very conscious, and I'm very conscious not to make it into something. But I know that Neil Richmond will be speaking at the event next week, and that James O'Connor was speaking at another event. But I take your point. I mean, obviously, it's going to challenge everyone. When we're moving towards the United Ireland. I think your points in relation to the schools is really interesting and a really important point, and obviously in terms of the National Health Service, absolutely.
Thanks, Mairéad. I think there's one other contribution here at the back.
Hi, Shane Curley is my name. I actually am a Fianna Fáil County Councillor, just for clarity.
Yes,
but I suppose just to respond to Brendan slightly, I know you're saying that there are many within Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or any major party who has been in power for the last 100 years who would kind of try and hang on to power by, in some way, maybe obstructing the United Ireland because they see the fact that Sinn Féin will come in to that space and maybe have a lot more power. And look, if that does happen, fine, but from my own personal perspective as a Fianna Fáil councillor, you'll have no problem persuading me. I wouldn't, one of my main reasons, one of my main objectives in life is to see United Ireland in my lifetime, or at some point, or to contribute to that as positively as I can. I suppose I am a Republican. I'm a fluent Irish speaker. I hold my Irish identity very, very dearly to my heart, and I don't think you've the full picture correctly in your head, Brendan, when you say that you're going to have an awful lot of trouble converting Fianna Fáil as an entity. There may be some within the party, but I think there's a huge radical Republican element of, especially the youth wing of Fianna Fáil, who will come behind this and try and positively and respectfully bring about United Ireland in a very collegial way. And I'll certainly be one of those, so just to respond to that.
Thank you, Shane. Any other contributions? There's one more contribution, and we'll be bringing matters to a close now soon because it's starting to...
How you doing? Philip McDonald is my name. And I'd just like to pick up on something the speaker mentioned earlier on. Could we afford a United Ireland? And that's very pejorative and all that sort of stuff. But I would suggest yes. And a couple of figures I'd like to just to praise the audience of. Is that the GDP in the Republic is 9 times what it is in the North. The population, north to south, is roughly 2.5 times. The exports from the Republic, wait for it, are 480 billion. The exports from the North are 10 billion. The subvention, which I think Mairéad mentioned, is circa 2.5 or whatever it is. The Brits won't tell you the exact figure. So, and that's, if there's no levelling up, and if we didn't have partition, the island would be exporting circa that amount of exports. So 2 billion in the context of that, and also in the context, pardon me, that during the crash here we wasted 100 billion that could have been gone on housing for our young people and all that type of stuff. So the short answer, with respect to, is yes. And the NHS in the North, and its funding, the funding for the HSE in the Republic is approximately 30% more per capita. You know, the waiting lists, which I just Googled in response to, for a hip replacement in the North is 74 weeks. In the Republic, it's 182 days, which is 26 weeks. So I think we can do better. I think we can afford a United Ireland, and I hope it happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to make a final contribution before we wrap things up? No, I don't think anyone else wants to come in. I think we'll bring matters to a close there. I want to thank everybody. for their contributions this evening. There have been some very interesting points raised and some very interesting points made. And I think if anything comes as a result of this, it is, in my head anyways, the amount of work that needs to be done, the amount of discussion that needs to be had, and the amount of persuasion not in a political way, but a persuasion to people that they need to talk, that they need to open up and flesh out their ideas about these things, and not leave it until there's a political campaign for a referendum, because by the very nature of a political campaign, you have yes and no, and you have people retreating to corners. I don't know if either of the panelists, Paul wants to make a final point.
Yeah, just exactly on that note. I mean, an event like this, of its nature, unless somebody's determined to be disruptive, inevitably attracts people who are broadly in favour of the proposition. But it's quite clear that even in a group like this, where the ultimate aim might be shared probably by most of the people in the room, there would be diverse views on how we get there. And I think it's really important that as we work towards it, we do get that diversity into the room, that we don't end up creating echo chambers, that we actually ask ourselves and each other the really hardest questions and try and address those and try and resolve those along the way. The last thing we can afford to do, and you alluded to Scotland earlier, the last thing we can do is go into a referendum saying we'll sort out some of the big questions afterwards. I think that would be a really fundamental mistake. We have got to be asking ourselves and each other, and even those who are not in the room, asking them what the alternatives are in the hope that that might entice them into the room to engage, or into the discussion to engage. And we need to be doing that before a referendum happens, not afterwards.
Thank you, Fol. Anyone else like to make a final contribution, or are you all ready for your beds at this stage of the night? A few words of thanks. Thanks to Jerry Carlisle and Ireland's Future for organising the event, and to the hotel here, obviously, for providing the facilities. And thanks again to the panel, Paul Doherty and Imam, Ibrahim, Noonan, Calvary, Movery and Mairéad, Farrell, Sachtadala. Thanks to you for coming along on a Thursday night in the dead of winter, because we are in the dead of winter now, unfortunately. And I look forward to seeing many more of these kinds of conversations and people coming out and engaging in this whole subject. And Gurmila Mahagig is Iwag Slánawala.